I wore my oldest coat on purpose the day I met my daughter-in-law's family, the one with the loose thread at the sleeve and the faded lining I never bothered to fix, because I wanted to see how they would look at me before they knew anything about me. And the moment I stepped into their perfectly staged living room, with its polished hardwood floors and carefully arranged white orchids, I saw it immediately, that flicker in their eyes, that quick calculation people try to hide when they think they're being polite, but aren't quite good enough at it to fool someone who's spent decades reading between the lines. And when her mother smiled at me, it didn't reach her eyes. It stopped right at the edges like a door she wasn't willing to open, and she said, "Oh, you must be Daniel's mother," in a tone that felt less like a welcome and more like an assessment, as if she were checking a box on a list she had already made about me. And I smiled back, soft and quiet, the way I've learned to do when I want people to underestimate me, because that's exactly what I needed them to do: underestimate me, dismiss me, decide too quickly who I was and what I was worth. And I let my purse rest on my lap, the worn leather creased from years of use, even though I had 10 others at home that cost more than their entire coffee table. And I noticed how her father glanced at it, just for a second, but long enough to register his judgment. And Sophia, my son's fiancée, sat beside Daniel with that perfectly composed posture, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if to remind him, and maybe me, exactly where his loyalty was supposed to be now. And when her brother asked me what I did for a living, I tilted my head slightly and said, "Oh, nothing too important," letting the words fall gently, harmlessly, even though I had built a company from the ground up before he had likely finished college. And I watched the shift happen in real time, the subtle relaxation, the quiet dismissal, the way the questions stopped being curious and started becoming condescending, like they had already placed me into a category that didn't require further exploration, and Daniel didn't correct them. That was the part that settled heavily in my chest. He didn't say a word, didn't mention the life I had given him, the sacrifices I had made, the stability I had built so he could sit comfortably in that room without ever worrying about where his next opportunity would come from. He just sat there, smiling politely, as if none of it mattered, as if I didn't matter. And I realized then, sitting in that room filled with soft lighting and sharp judgments, that this wasn't just a meeting, it was a test. Not of me, but of them, and they had no idea they were already failing it, because every glance, every carefully phrased question about financial stability and future plans, every pause before they responded to something I said was telling me exactly what they valued, and more importantly, what they didn't. And I nodded along, playing my part perfectly, letting them believe the story they were so eager to accept. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing at all and watch people reveal who they really are. And as I sat there, unnoticed in the way they thought mattered, I made a quiet decision I wouldn't share with anyone just yet. I wouldn't correct them. I wouldn't defend myself. I would let them keep thinking I was just a poor, naive mother who had nothing to offer, because what they didn't know, what none of them knew in that moment, was that they had just shown me everything I needed to see. I did not say anything when we left that house, not in the car, not even when Daniel glanced over at me as if waiting for some kind of reaction, because silence has a way of making people uncomfortable in ways words never can, and I could feel it. The tension sitting between us like something unfinished, but I kept my eyes forward, watching the quiet suburban streets pass by, each house looking almost identical to the last. Perfectly trimmed lawns, spotless driveways, the kind of place where everything looks right on the outside, even when it is not. And after a few minutes he cleared his throat and said, "They liked you," in that careful tone people use when they're trying to smooth something over before it has a chance to become a problem. And I nodded once, slowly, as if I believed him, even though I had seen the truth with far more clarity than he ever could, because I was not distracted by love or expectation. I was simply observing, and I said, "They seem very particular," choosing the word carefully, not too harsh, not too soft, just enough to let him know I had noticed without forcing him to confront it. And he gave a small laugh, dismissive, like it was nothing, like I was overthinking something that had already settled in his mind as acceptable. And that was when I understood something that settled deeper than anything that had happened in that living room. It was not just them I needed to watch, it was him too, because people do not change overnight. They shift slowly, piece by piece, until one day you realize you no longer recognize the person sitting beside you. And when we pulled into my apartment complex, I could feel his eyes scanning the building in the same way her family had scanned me. Quick, subtle, but telling. And I reached for the door handle before he could say anything else, because I did not need to hear it. Whatever polite version of concern he was about to offer, whatever suggestion wrapped in kindness that would somehow imply I should be doing better, living better, being better, and I stepped out into the cool afternoon air, the kind that carries just enough bite to make you aware of your surroundings. And I turned back to him with a small smile that revealed nothing. "Thank you for dinner," I said, simple, calm, as if everything was exactly as it should be, and he hesitated for a second. Like he wanted to say more, like there was something sitting just beneath the surface that he could not quite bring himself to voice. But instead he nodded and said, "We should do it again sometime." And I agreed because I knew we would. And the next time would not be about introductions or first impressions. It would be about confirmation, about seeing how far their assumptions would go when they thought there was nothing left to uncover. And as I walked up the narrow staircase to my apartment, each step steady and deliberate, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger, not even disappointment, but clarity, the kind that comes when all the pieces start to align in a way you cannot ignore. And once inside, I closed the door quietly behind me and stood there for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me, familiar, controlled, entirely mine. And then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone, scrolling through messages I had not needed to check until now, because timing matters, and there are moments when acting too soon ruins everything, and moments when waiting just a little longer gives you exactly what you need. And I had a feeling this was going to require patience, the kind that does not look like strength from the outside, but is, in reality, the strongest position you can hold, because the less you reveal, the more others will show you. And that night, as I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold, I replayed every word, every glance, every pause, not because I was hurt, but because I was learning. And the more I learned, the clearer it became that this was never going to be a simple family matter. It was a game of perception, of value, of control, and they had already decided what role I played in it. They just did not realize I was the one quietly rewriting the rules. The next few days passed quietly on the surface, the kind of quiet that can fool anyone who is not paying attention, but I have never trusted silence that comes too easily, because real peace does not feel like something waiting underneath. And I could feel it, the subtle shift in the way Daniel spoke to me on the phone, the way his words became more measured, more distant, as if he were choosing them carefully to avoid stepping into something he did not want to confront. And when he mentioned that Sophia's parents had invited us over again for Sunday dinner, I agreed without hesitation, because I had already decided that I needed to see more, not just what they showed me when they were being polite, but what slipped through when they thought there was nothing left to prove. And that afternoon I dressed the same way, simple, understated, nothing that would challenge the image they had already formed. And when I arrived, the welcome felt smoother this time, practiced like they had adjusted their approach now that they believed they understood me. And her mother greeted me with a warmer smile, but it was the kind that comes from confidence, not kindness, the confidence of thinking you are dealing with someone predictable. And I let her have that. I let all of them have that, because it made them comfortable, and comfortable people make mistakes. And over dinner, I noticed how the conversation shifted, less about introductions and more about plans, about the future, about what Daniel and Sophia intended to build together. And her father leaned back in his chair and said, "It is important to have a strong financial foundation these days," his eyes flicking toward me for just a moment before returning to his plate, as if the statement was general, but the meaning was not. And Sophia added, "We have been talking about combining things, simplifying everything," her voice light, but her hand resting firmly on Daniel's arm again. And I saw it then, the pattern, the way they framed everything as practical, reasonable, necessary, words that sound harmless until you look at what they are actually leading toward. And Daniel nodded along, agreeing in that quiet way that told me he had already been part of these conversations long before I was ever invited into the room. And I took a small sip of water, steady, composed, and said, "That sounds like a big step," giving them just enough encouragement to continue, because people rarely stop talking when they think they are being understood. And her mother smiled again and said, "Well, when you are building a life, You have to be careful about what you take on. And there it was, hidden in plain sight. Not an insult, not directly, but clear enough for anyone willing to hear it. And I nodded as if I agreed, as if I were grateful for their concern. And for a moment, no one questioned it. No one pushed further. Because in their minds, the situation was already settled. I was simply part of the past. Something Daniel would eventually outgrow. Something that did not fit into the future they were carefully constructing for him. And as the evening went on, I watched the small details. The way Sophia answered questions for him before he could speak. The way her father directed conversations toward investments and assets. The way her mother observed everything without saying too much, and it became clearer with each passing minute that this was not just a family, it was a system, one that knew exactly what it wanted and how to position itself to get it, and by the time dinner ended and we stood to leave, I already knew more than they realized they had revealed, because sometimes the truth is not in what people say directly. It is in the pattern of what they choose to emphasize, and as we walked out into the cool evening air, Daniel glanced at me again, searching for something, approval, maybe, or reassurance. But I only gave him the same calm smile I had given him before, because I was not ready to speak yet, not until I had seen enough to understand exactly what game they thought they were playing, and more importantly, how far they were willing to take it. It was not until later that week, when Daniel stopped by my apartment unannounced, that I saw the next piece fall into place, and I knew the moment he stepped inside that he had not come just to visit, because there was a stiffness in the way he moved, a hesitation in the way he looked around the room, as if he were seeing it differently now, not as the place where he had grown up visiting, but as something temporary, something insufficient, and he stood there for a second longer than necessary. Before sitting down, his hands clasped together in front of him, and I could almost hear the conversation that had already happened somewhere else, words planted carefully, ideas introduced slowly, until they no longer felt like suggestions, but like conclusions he had reached on his own, and he cleared his throat and said, "Mom, have you ever thought about making things a little easier for yourself?" And there it was, wrapped in concern, softened by tone, but unmistakable in intention. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, giving him space to continue because people rarely reveal everything at once. They build toward it, step by step, hoping you will meet them halfway without realizing where you are being led. And he went on talking about convenience, about not having to worry about expenses, about simplifying life. Words that sounded reasonable until you noticed what was missing, the part where anyone had actually asked what I wanted, and I nodded slowly, as if considering it, even though I had already understood exactly where this was going, and I said, "And what would that look like?" Keeping my voice calm, curious, just enough to encourage him without challenging him, and he hesitated for a brief moment before saying, "Well, Sophia and I were thinking maybe it would make sense to combine things, to have everything in one place, so we can help manage it." And he did not look at me when he said it, which told me more than his words ever could, because people only avoid eye contact when they are unsure of the ground they are standing on, and I let a small silence settle between us before responding, because silence forces people to sit with what they have just said, and often they will fill it with more than they intended, and sure enough, he added, "It is just practical, Mom. It would take the pressure off you." And I could almost hear Sophia's voice in that sentence, not his. Not really, because I had raised him to speak with more certainty than that, and I folded my hands gently in my lap and gave him a soft smile, the kind that reassures without agreeing, and I said, "That is very thoughtful of you," and I watched the relief flicker across his face, brief but real, because he thought he had succeeded, thought I had accepted the idea without resistance, and that was exactly what I needed him to believe, because resistance would have made them more careful, more strategic, but acceptance, or what looked like acceptance, would make them comfortable, and comfort makes people reveal their full intentions, and after a few more minutes of light conversation, he stood to leave, clearly satisfied with how things had gone, and as I walked him to the door, he paused for a second, as if waiting for something more, maybe gratitude, maybe confirmation, but I simply said, "Drive safely," and closed the door gently behind him, and as the quiet settled back into the room, I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in, not as a shock, but as confirmation, because now I knew not just what they were thinking, but what they were planning, and more importantly, how they expected it to unfold, and I walked back to the table, picked up my phone, and opened the contact I had not needed until now. Because there is a point in every situation where observation is no longer enough, where understanding must turn into preparation, and as I stared at the name on the screen, I realized that they had just taken their first real step, the one they believed would bring them closer to control. Without realizing that it had done something else entirely, it had shown me exactly how far they were willing to go, and that was all I needed to begin. The next morning I made the call, not with urgency, not with emotion, but with the kind of calm that comes when a decision has already been made long before the action itself. And when the familiar voice on the other end answered, I did not need to explain much, because some relationships are built over years of quiet understanding, and I simply said, I think it is time we review everything. And there was a pause, not of confusion, but of recognition, as if the words carried more meaning than they appeared to, and we agreed to meet that afternoon. And when I arrived at the office, everything felt exactly as it always had, orderly, precise, the kind of place where nothing is left to assumption, and as I sat across from him, I placed my hands calmly on the table and began to outline what had been happening, not as a complaint, not as a reaction, but as a series of observations, each one clear, each one measured. And he listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, occasionally making a note, and when I finished, he leaned back slightly and said, "And what would you like to do?" And that question mattered more than anything else, because it was not about what could be done, it was about what I chose to do, and I let a brief silence settle before answering, because I wanted the words to be exact. I want everything secured, structured in a way that no one can access or influence without my explicit consent. And he nodded again, as if this was not unusual, as if he had seen this before in different forms, different families, different circumstances, and perhaps he had, because situations like this rarely begin loudly. They begin quietly, with suggestions, with shifts, with small steps that seem harmless until they are not. And for the next hour we went through every detail, every account, every asset, every document, ensuring that nothing could be moved, changed, or even discussed without my knowledge. And when it was done, I felt something settle into place, not relief, not satisfaction, but control, the kind that does not need to be announced, because it exists whether anyone else sees it or not. And as I left the office, I checked my phone and saw a message from Daniel, simple, casual, asking if I would be free for dinner later that week, and I stared at it for a moment, considering not the words themselves, but what sat behind them, because timing is never accidental in situations like this. And I knew this invitation was not just about dinner, it was about continuation, about moving forward with whatever plan had already been set in motion, and I replied with a short, agreeable answer, because I needed them to believe everything was unfolding exactly as they expected. And over the next few days, I noticed the pattern becoming clearer, more direct, Sophia calling more often, her tone warmer now, more attentive, asking questions about my routine, my expenses, my plans, all framed as concern, all delivered with just enough care to make them seem genuine, and I responded the same way each time, open, cooperative, never revealing more than I intended, because the more they believed I was willing to share, the more they revealed about what they were truly interested in. And one evening, as I sat alone with a cup of tea growing cold beside me, I realized that the situation had shifted completely. It was no longer about whether they were trying to influence something. That was already clear. It was about how far they would go once they believed there was nothing standing in their way. And I was not watching for the obvious. I was waiting for the moment when they stopped being careful, because that is when people show you everything, and when they did, I intended to be ready. By the time the dinner invitation came, I already knew it would not be just another evening of polite conversation and careful smiles, because there was a rhythm to everything now, a progression that had become too consistent to ignore. And when I arrived at their house that night, I noticed the difference immediately, not in what was said, but in how it was arranged, the table set more formally, the lighting softer, the atmosphere intentionally warm, as if they were creating the perfect setting for something important to unfold. And Sophia greeted me at the door with a level of enthusiasm that felt slightly too measured. Her voice just a little brighter than before, her touch lingering a second longer on my arm, and I returned the gesture with the same calm politeness I had maintained from the beginning, because consistency is what keeps people comfortable. and comfort is what makes them reveal their intentions without realizing it. And as we sat down to dinner, the conversation began lightly, moving through familiar topics before gradually shifting, almost imperceptibly, toward the future, and her father leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table as he said, "We have all been thinking about what comes next," and there was something in the way he said, "all," that made it clear this had been discussed long before I was included, and Daniel nodded beside Sophia, not speaking, but aligning himself with the statement in a way that told me he was already part of whatever they were about to present, and I set my fork down gently, giving them my full attention, not as a participant, but as an observer, because this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when caution would give way to confidence, and confidence would lead to clarity, and Sophia smiled, her expression composed, almost reassuring as she said, "We just want to make sure everyone is taken care of, especially you," and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the concern without accepting its premise, because concern, when repeated often enough, can become a tool, and I was beginning to see exactly how they intended to use it. And her mother added, "It can be overwhelming to manage everything alone, especially as time goes on," her tone gentle, her words carefully chosen, but the direction unmistakable, and I let a small pause settle before responding, allowing the weight of their suggestion to sit in the space between us, because silence invites elaboration, and as expected, her father continued, "We think it would be wise to start consolidating things now, making sure everything is streamlined, efficient, protected," and there it was again, that language of practicality, of reason, of inevitability, each word designed to make the idea sound less like a proposal and more like a necessity, and I nodded slowly, as if considering it seriously, even though I had already anticipated every part of this conversation, and I said, "That sounds like a thoughtful approach," giving them exactly what they needed to continue, because agreement or the appearance of it encourages people to go further than they planned, and Sophia reached across the table, placing a folder neatly in front of me, her movements deliberate, controlled, and she said, "We even put together some preliminary ideas, just to make things easier for you," and I looked down at the folder without opening it, because the contents were not as important as the gesture itself, the assumption that I would accept, that I would follow, that I would allow them to take the lead in something that had always been mine to control, and I lifted my eyes back to hers, offering a small, appreciative smile, and said, "You have certainly given this a lot of thought," and she returned the smile, but there was something beneath it now, something sharper, something that had been waiting for this moment, and as the conversation continued, I listened carefully, noting every detail, every expectation, every quiet agreement that passed between them without words, and by the time the evening came to an end, I understood completely, not just what they wanted, but how certain they were that they would get it, and as I stood to leave, holding the unopened folder in my hands, I realized that they believed the next step was already decided, that all that remained was for me to follow along, and I gave them no reason to think otherwise, because sometimes the most effective response is not to resist, but to let others believe they are already in control, right up until the moment they discover they never were. When I got home that night, I did not open the folder right away. I placed it carefully on the table and sat down across from it as if it were something that needed to be understood before it was touched, because there is a difference between reacting and responding, and I had no intention of doing the first, and the room was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts with uncomfortable clarity, and I replayed the evening again, not the words themselves, but the confidence behind them, the way they had already positioned everything as decided, as inevitable, and that was when I realized something important. They were no longer testing the waters, they believed they were already standing on solid ground, and that belief would be their weakness, because certainty makes people careless in ways doubt never does, and after a few minutes, I reached forward and opened the folder, not with curiosity, but with purpose, and inside were documents, neatly organized, clearly prepared in advance, outlining plans that went far beyond simple help. There were suggestions about transferring oversight, consolidating accounts, restructuring ownership in ways that sounded efficient on the surface, but quietly shifted control, and I read each page slowly, carefully, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to see how far they had gone in assuming I would agree, and the further I read, the clearer it became that this had never been about support. It was about access, about positioning themselves in a way that would allow them to influence decisions that were not theirs to make. And when I finished, I closed the folder gently and sat back, letting the weight of it settle, not as anger, but as confirmation, because now there was no uncertainty left, no question about intention, and I stood up, walked over to the small desk by the window, and placed the folder beside a stack of documents that had already been reviewed, already been secured, and for the first time since this had begun, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, not out of satisfaction, but out of clarity, because everything was now exactly where it needed to be, and over the next few days, I continued exactly as before, answering calls, agreeing to small suggestions, allowing them to believe that progress was being made, that their plan was unfolding smoothly, and I noticed how their tone changed again, becoming more assured, more direct, as if they were no longer trying to persuade me, but simply guiding me toward what they believed was already decided. And Daniel called more often now, his voice carrying a subtle urgency beneath its calm surface, asking if I had reviewed the documents, if I had any questions, if I was ready to move forward, and each time I gave him the same measured response. I am still looking things over. Not a refusal, not an agreement, just enough to keep everything in motion without revealing anything at all. And Sophia, on the other hand, became warmer, almost attentive in a way that might have seemed genuine to someone else, but I could see the pattern clearly now, the timing of her calls, the way she followed up after Daniel, reinforcing the same ideas. With a softer tone, as if they were working together, one to introduce, the other to reassure, and I allowed it, all of it, because the more they believed I was moving in their direction, the more they revealed about how they expected this to end. And one evening, as I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker on one by one, I realized that the situation had reached its turning point, not because anything had been said directly, but because everything important had already been revealed. And now it was no longer about observing or understanding. It was about timing, about choosing the exact moment when perception would shift, when the version of me they had created in their minds would no longer hold. And as I looked at the folder resting quietly on the desk, untouched since that night, I knew that moment was closer than they thought. Because the only thing more powerful than being underestimated is knowing exactly when to stop playing along. The invitation came 2 days later, just as I expected it would, phrased casually but timed too precisely to be coincidence. Sophia's voice light and warm as she said they wanted to host a small dinner, something simple, just family, a chance to sit down and go over everything together. And I agreed without hesitation, because this was the moment they believed they had been working toward, the moment where everything would finally align in their favor, and I could hear it in her tone, that quiet confidence, that assumption that I was ready, that I had already accepted the direction they had been guiding me toward. And the night of the dinner, I dressed the same way I always had, understated, unremarkable, exactly as they expected, because consistency reinforces belief, and belief is what keeps people from questioning what is right in front of them. And when I arrived, everything was arranged even more carefully than before, the table set with deliberate precision, the atmosphere calm but purposeful, and as I stepped inside, I noticed how quickly their attention shifted toward me, not with curiosity this time, but with anticipation, as if they were waiting for something specific, something they believed was already decided. And throughout the first part of the evening, the conversation stayed light, almost overly so, moving through safe topics with an ease that felt practiced, until finally, as the plates were cleared and the room settled into a quieter rhythm, her father leaned forward slightly and said, "We thought tonight would be a good time to finalize a few things," and there was no question in his voice, no uncertainty, just a statement delivered with the expectation of agreement, and I placed my hands calmly on the table, meeting his gaze with the same steady expression I had maintained from the beginning. Because this was no longer about observing, it was about timing, and I said, "I've been thinking about that as well," letting the words land gently, giving them exactly what they needed to move forward. And Sophia reached for the folder again, the same one, placing it carefully in front of me with a small, reassuring smile, and Daniel sat beside her, watching closely, his posture tense in a way that suggested he knew this moment mattered more than he was willing to admit. And I opened the folder slowly, not because I needed to read it again, but because the action itself mattered, the appearance of consideration, of willingness, and as I turned each page, I could feel their attention narrowing, their focus sharpening, waiting for the moment when I would confirm what they already believed to be true, and I let the silence stretch just a little longer than necessary because silence has a way of amplifying expectation. And when I finally looked up, I offered a small, thoughtful nod and said, "You have put a great deal of effort into this." And I saw it then, the subtle shift in their expressions, the quiet relief, the satisfaction of believing they had reached the outcome they wanted. And Sophia leaned slightly closer, her voice soft but certain as she said, "We just want what is best for everyone." And I held her gaze. For a moment, not long enough to make her uncomfortable, but long enough to let the weight of what she had just said settle, and then I closed the folder gently, placing it back on the table with the same calm precision I had used all evening, and in that moment, I knew they were ready, not because they had asked for anything directly, but because they no longer felt the need to. They believed the decision had already been made. And as the conversation continued, light, almost celebratory in its tone, I remained exactly as I had been from the beginning, composed, agreeable, giving them no reason to question what they thought they understood, because the most effective turning point is the one no one sees coming. And as the evening drew to a close and we stood to say our goodbyes, I could see it clearly in their faces, the quiet certainty that everything was now in place, that all that remained was a simple step forward. And I allowed them to hold on to that belief because it was the final piece I needed before everything changed.